These are 13 towns in Colorado that were built, thrived, and then emptied out completely, leaving behind some of the most haunting ruins in the American West. What makes Colorado's ghost towns different from abandoned places in other states is the elevation. These weren't prairie settlements that simply dried up. Many of them sat at 10,000 feet or higher, in terrain so rugged and remote that reaching them today still requires a four-wheel drive vehicle and a willingness to navigate roads that barely qualify as roads. We're going to walk through all 13 of these towns, starting with the ones you can still visit and ending with the one the government won't let you anywhere near. Wait until the last town, because the reason you can't get closer might scare you. If you've subscribed, let's quickly start with the first town. 1. St. Elmo. Up in Chaffee County, sitting at around 10,000 feet, St. Elmo is probably the most well-preserved ghost town in the entire state of Colorado. Founded in 1880 during the Gold and Silver Rush, the town grew quickly around the mines in the area, especially the Mary Murphy mine, which became one of the biggest producers in the region. At its peak, somewhere around 2,000 people called St. Elmo home, and the town had all the trappings of a real community, including hotels, a general store, a post office, a telegraph office, and even a town newspaper. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad ran a line through St. Elmo, which kept the town connected to the outside world and gave miners a way to ship ore down to the smelters. That rail connection was a lifeline, and when it shut down, the town started bleeding residents fast. Mines closed one by one through the early 1900s, and by the 1920s, most people had already moved on. What makes St. Elmo unusual is the Stark family. Annabelle and Tony Stark refused to leave and essentially became the last residents of the entire town. Annabelle in particular gained a reputation as something of a recluse and a fierce protector of St. Elmo, reportedly discouraging visitors and guarding the remaining buildings. The post office didn't officially close until 1952, which meant St. Elmo technically remained an active town long after everyone else had gone. Today, you can drive to St. Elmo on a dirt road during the summer months, and the town sits on the National Register of Historic Places. Several of the original structures still stand, including the general store and a handful of cabins, and the resident chipmunk population has become almost as famous as the town itself, with visitors coming specifically to feed them. The combination of accessible roads, well-preserved buildings, and that strange feeling of walking through a town that time simply forgot makes St. Elmo the most popular ghost town destination in Colorado, and a good starting point for understanding what the mining era actually looked like on the ground. 2. Ashcroft. About 10 miles from the ski resort town of Aspen, Ashcroft sits in a valley near Castle Creek at roughly 9,500 feet. Founded around 1880, the town boomed during the Silver Rush and quickly swelled to an estimated 2,000 residents. During its peak years, Ashcroft had 2 newspapers, which gives you some idea of how seriously the residents took their town. There were also multiple saloons, a school, sawmills, and the kind of optimism that only a mining boom can produce. That optimism didn't last long. Silver prices began dropping in the mid-1880s, and Ashcroft's population collapsed almost overnight as miners moved on to richer strikes, many of them heading to Aspen itself. By the early 1890s, the town was effectively dead, and the buildings started their long decay. One of the more interesting chapters in Ashcroft's story came decades later during World War II, when the U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division used the area around Ashcroft as a training ground for mountain and winter warfare. Soldiers trained in the harsh conditions near town before deploying to fight in the Italian Alps, which means this little ghost town played a small but real role in the war effort. The irony is hard to miss. A town that couldn't sustain itself because of brutal mountain conditions turned out to be the perfect training environment for soldiers who needed to learn how to fight in brutal mountain conditions. The Aspen Historical Society now manages the site and offers guided tours during the summer. A handful of weathered log structures remain standing against a backdrop of peaks and aspen groves, and the combination of easy access from Aspen and genuine historical atmosphere makes Ashcroft one of the most visited ghost towns in Colorado. On a clear day, with the late afternoon light hitting those silver-gray cabins and the peaks towering behind them, Ashcroft might be the most photogenic abandoned town in the state. 3. Independence. On the 4th of July. In 1879, a group of prospectors struck gold in the Sawatch Range near what would become Aspen, and they named their new settlement Independence in honor of the holiday. The town sprang up fast at around 10,900 feet of elevation, which made it one of the highest mining camps in Colorado and one of the most brutal places to spend a winter. At its peak, Independence may have held around 1,500 residents, all of them enduring conditions that could turn lethal between November and April. The winters at nearly 11,000 feet are no joke, with temperatures plummeting well below zero and snow piling up in quantities that could bury a cabin. Supply lines would get cut off for weeks at a time, and the isolation wore people down. There's a well-known story about the winter of 1899, when a group of residents decided they'd had enough. According to local accounts, they dismantled their homes and used the lumber to build giant skis, then essentially skied their way over the mountains to Aspen, roughly 15 miles away. Whether every detail of that story is accurate, it captures the desperation that drove people out of Independence. The Aspen Historical Society also manages Independence, and you can visit the ruins during summer months along the road over Independence Pass. What's left includes several collapsed cabins and mining structures scattered across an alpine meadow, all of it sitting above tree line with panoramic mountain views in every direction. The pass road itself, Highway 82, is one of the highest paved mountain crossings in North America, and it closes every winter due to snow, which means Independence gets buried under the same white blanket that drove its residents out over a century ago. Every spring, when the plows finally cut through and the road reopens, those old buildings emerge again from the snowpack like they're being uncovered for the first time. 4. Animas Forks, deep in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, at an elevation of roughly 11,200 feet, Animas Forks ranks among the highest ghost towns in the entire country. Founded around 1873, the settlement served miners working silver and gold claims in the surrounding peaks, and at its busiest, it housed somewhere around 450 people. The most recognizable structure in Animas Forks is the Walsh House, a large bay-windowed home that belonged to Tom Walsh. Walsh later left the San Juans and went on to purchase the Hope Diamond, one of the most famous gemstones in history, which makes his connection to this tiny mountain settlement an unexpected footnote in the story of that legendary jewel. The house still stands, its distinctive windows staring out across the valley. Winters at 11,200 feet were absolutely punishing. Snow reportedly drifted as high as 25 feet in some seasons, trapping anyone who hadn't left before the passes closed. That kind of snowfall eventually contributed to the town's decline because keeping a community operational in those conditions required constant effort and expense that became harder to justify as the mines slowed down. Animas Forks is accessible by four-wheel drive road from Silverton, and it sits on the Alpine Loop, a popular backcountry scenic route that also connects to Lake City and Ouray. Several original buildings remain, including the Walsh House and other cabins in various states of collapse, and the San Juan County Historical Society has worked to stabilize some of the structures. Reaching the town requires navigating rough mountain roads that are only passable in summer, which keeps the crowds manageable and the experience genuinely remote. On a good day in July or August, you might share the town with a handful of other visitors and a few jeeps, but the sense of isolation at 11,200 feet, surrounded by peaks on all sides, stays with you regardless of who else is there. 5. Tincup, originally called Virginia City, before a name change, Tincup sits in Gunnison County and earned a reputation as one of the rowdiest and most lawless mining camps in Colorado during the early 1880s. Founded around 1879 after gold was discovered in the area, the town attracted the kind of population that made law enforcement a dangerous profession. Several town marshals were killed during Tincup's wildest years, and the violence became so notorious that the town's cemetery tells its own story. The graveyard is divided into sections, with different areas reportedly designated based on how the person died, whether it was natural causes, gunfight, or other circumstances. That cemetery remains one of the most visited features of the town. Gold production kept Tincup alive through the 1880s, but as claims played out and easier opportunities appeared elsewhere, the population drained steadily. Unlike some Colorado ghost towns that emptied out completely, Tincup retained a tiny seasonal population over the decades, with a few cabins used as summer residences. You can still drive to Tincup today, and while most of the original buildings are gone, a handful of old structures remain alongside the cemetery. The town sits at around 10,100 feet and is reachable by dirt road in summer, though the passes leading in close during winter. The combination of its violent history and its beautiful mountain setting gives Tincup a character that's distinct from the more genteel ghost towns near Aspen. Where Ashcroft and Independence feel peaceful and melancholy, Tincup feels like the kind of place where things went sideways regularly, and the cemetery at the edge of town is the proof. 6. Vicksburg and 7. Winfield. These two tiny settlements sit within a few miles of each other along Clear Creek in Chaffee County, not far from St. Elmo. Both were born from the same silver boom in the early 1880s and died from the same silver bust. Winfield was founded around 1881 and at its height housed an estimated 1,500 residents who worked the silver mines in the surrounding mountains. The town had the usual amenities of a mining camp, including stores, saloons, and all the infrastructure needed to keep miners supplied and spending their wages. Vicksburg was smaller, but served a similar function along the creek. What killed both towns was the silver crash of 1893, when the federal government repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which had been propping up silver prices by requiring the U.S. Treasury to buy millions of ounces of silver each year. When that law disappeared, silver prices cratered overnight, and mining towns across Colorado emptied out in a wave that reshaped the state's entire economy. Winfield and Vicksburg were among the casualties, and their story repeated itself in dozens of other mountain communities that same year. The 1893 crash wasn't just an economic event. It was a mass exodus, and entire regions of the Colorado Rockies went silent within months. Today, both sites are accessible by four-wheel drive road and contain a scattering of original cabins and structures. The Clear Creek Valley they sit in is beautiful and relatively quiet, making them appealing destinations for hikers and off-road enthusiasts who want a ghost town experience without the crowds that St. Elmo sometimes draws during peak summer weekends. Visiting Vicksburg and Winfield together in a single trip gives you a sense of how these small mining communities existed in clusters connected by creek valleys and mountain passes, each one dependent on the same fragile economics that could collapse without warning. 8. Hancock. Hancock owes its existence not to mining, but to one of the most ambitious railroad projects in Colorado history, the Alpine Tunnel. Built by the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad in the early 1880s, the Alpine Tunnel was the first railroad tunnel bored through the Continental Divide, running at an elevation of roughly 11,600 feet. Hancock served as the eastern approach town for the tunnel, functioning as a railroad stop and supply point. Building the tunnel at that altitude was an extraordinary engineering challenge. Workers had to contend with thin air, extreme cold, unstable rock, and avalanche danger, all while carving through the spine of the continent. The completed tunnel measured roughly 1,800 feet in length and connected the eastern and western slopes, opening up new routes for ore shipments and passenger traffic. The problem was maintenance. Keeping a tunnel operational at nearly 12,000 feet meant constant battles with snow, ice, water infiltration, and structural damage. The railroad eventually abandoned the tunnel in the early 1900s as costs mounted and alternative routes became available, and that decision stripped Hancock of its reason for existing. Hancock is reachable by rough road in summer, and visitors can still see remnants of the railroad grade, some collapsed structures, and the eastern portal of the Alpine Tunnel itself. The tunnel has partially collapsed over the years, but the portal opening remains visible, a dark hole in the mountainside that marks where an army of workers once carved through solid rock at nearly 12,000 feet. The area is managed as part of the San Isabel National Forest, and the tunnel's historical significance as a pioneering feat of mountain railroad engineering gives Hancock a story that stands apart from the typical mining ghost town narrative. While most Colorado ghost towns owe their existence to someone finding precious metal in a creek bed, Hancock owed its existence to a railroad company betting it could punch a hole through the Continental Divide and keep it open year-round. That bet didn't pay off. 9. Ironton. Along the stretch of U.S. Route 550, known as the $1 Million Highway between Ouray and Silverton in the San Juan Mountains, the remains of Ironton sit in a wide valley ringed by red-tinged peaks. Founded around 1883, Ironton was part of the Red Mountain Mining District and benefited from the silver wealth being pulled out of the surrounding mountains. The town reached a peak population estimated at around 1,000 residents and functioned as a supply hub and residential center for miners working the Red Mountain area. Like so many others, Ironton took a devastating hit from the 1893 silver crash, but it lingered longer than most, with some mining activity continuing into the early 20th century before the town finally emptied out. Driving the $1 Million Highway today, you pass through the Ironton Valley and can see the remnants of the town from the road. The setting is dramatic even by Colorado standards, with steep mountain walls closing in on both sides and the rusted colors of mineral-rich rock staining the peaks above. A few structures remain standing, and the site is accessible without needing a four-wheel drive vehicle, which makes it one of the easier San Juan ghost towns to reach. The $1 Million Highway itself has its own mythology. The name's origin is debated, with some claiming it refers to the cost of building the road and others suggesting the roadbed contains gold-bearing gravel worth $1 million per mile. Either way, driving through Ironton's remains on that road is one of the more atmospheric experiences you can have in Colorado. 10. Carson. At roughly 12,000 feet of elevation, Carson competes with Animas Forks for the title of one of Colorado's highest ghost towns. Located in Hinsdale County in the San Juan Mountains, the settlement was founded around 1881 by Christopher J. Carson, who staked silver claims in the area and attracted enough followers to build a small community in an incredibly harsh environment. Living and mining at 12,000 feet is borderline extreme, even by Colorado mountain standards. The growing season is essentially non-existent. Winter starts early and ends late, and every supply had to be hauled up by pack animal over mountain passes that spent much of the year buried under snow. Carson never grew particularly large, and the combination of altitude, isolation, and the 1893 silver crash ensured that the town's lifespan was measured in years rather than decades. Getting to Carson today requires a serious four-wheel drive vehicle and favorable weather, as the roads leading in are rough, steep, and only passable for a few months each year. A few remnants of cabins and mining structures remain at the site, surrounded by tundra and scree fields above tree line. For people willing to make the drive, Carson offers one of the most isolated and genuinely remote ghost town experiences in the state, with views that stretch across the San Juans in every direction. 11. Alta. Perched high above Telluride in San Miguel County, the mining settlement of Alta was founded around 1877 after gold was discovered in the area. The town served miners working claims in the mountains above what is now one of Colorado's premier ski resort towns, and at its peak, it housed a working community with the standard amenities of a Colorado mining camp. Alta's decline followed the familiar pattern of falling mineral prices and depleted claims. By the early 1900s, the town had mostly emptied out. What sets Alta apart visually is its location near the stunning Alta Lakes, a series of alpine lakes surrounded by wildflower meadows and dramatic peaks that have made the area popular with photographers and hikers. The ghost town itself contains some remaining structures in various stages of decay, and the area is accessible by dirt road from Telluride during summer months. The proximity to a modern resort town creates an interesting contrast, with multi-million-dollar homes and luxury hotels sitting just a few miles from a crumbling 19th century mining settlement, where people lived and worked in conditions that would horrify most modern visitors. 12. Dearfield. Every other town on this list died because of mining, railroads, or impossible mountain conditions. Dearfield is different. Located on the plains of Weld County in northeastern Colorado, Dearfield was founded in 1910 by Oliver T. Jackson, an African-American entrepreneur who envisioned a self-sustaining black agricultural colony on the Colorado prairie. Jackson's vision grew out of a broader movement in the early 20th century to establish independent black communities across the American West, places where African Americans could own land, build businesses, and live free from the discrimination and violence that defined life in much of the country during the Jim Crow era. He recruited settlers, organized the purchase of land, and worked to build Dearfield into a functioning town with farms, businesses, a lunch counter, a gas station, a dance hall, and a population that reached an estimated 700 people at its peak. For a time, it worked. Dearfield was a living community where Black families owned property, ran enterprises, and built something that belonged to them in a country that often denied them that opportunity. The Great Depression and the Dust Bowl destroyed Dearfield. Crop failures, drought, and economic collapse hit the small farming community hard, and residents left in search of work and survival elsewhere. The same forces that devastated white farming communities across the Great Plains hit Dearfield with equal ferocity, and the town didn't have the financial reserves or institutional support to absorb the blow. Jackson himself stayed on long after most others had gone, refusing to abandon the community he'd built. He died in 1948, and with him went the last real connection to Dearfield's original purpose. Dearfield was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2018, and preservation efforts have been underway to stabilize the remaining structures and tell the story of this unique community. Unlike every other ghost town on this list, Dearfield's story isn't about mining wealth or railroad routes. It's about the ambition and resilience of Black settlers trying to build something permanent on the American frontier, and the forces that ultimately made that impossible. 13. Gilman. And then there's Gilman, which is unlike anything else on this list for an entirely different reason. Located in Eagle County, Gilman sits on a cliff ledge 300 feet above the Eagle River, and from a distance, it looks like something out of a post-apocalyptic film. The town was established around 1886 to house workers for zinc and lead mining operations in the area. And over the decades, it grew into a company town owned and operated by the New Jersey Zinc Company, which controlled the mines and essentially controlled the town. At its peak, Gilman was a functioning community with homes, a school, and services, all of it perched on that dramatic cliff edge above the valley floor. The mines produced zinc, lead, and other minerals for decades, and the town hummed along as the company kept operating. What ended Gilman wasn't a silver crash or a harsh winter. The Environmental Protection Agency designated the area as a Superfund site due to contamination from decades of mining operations. Heavy metals and mining waste had poisoned the soil and groundwater, and in 1984, the EPA ordered the entire town evacuated. Every single resident had to leave, and Gilman became one of the very few American towns emptied not by economics or weather, but by government order in response to environmental contamination. Nobody has lived in Gilman since that evacuation. The town is now privately owned, fenced off, and closed to the public, with no trespassing signs posted along the perimeter. You can see it from the highway, this cluster of buildings clinging to a cliff with no signs of life, but you cannot legally enter. The contamination issues are still being managed, and the cleanup process has been ongoing for decades. People who drive past Gilman on Interstate 70 or the highway through the Eagle River Valley often don't even realize they're looking at a ghost town because the buildings appear intact from a distance. It looks like a town that simply paused, not one that was forcibly emptied. Gilman's story raises uncomfortable questions that the romantic ghost town narrative usually avoids. Most abandoned mining towns get treated as picturesque relics of a colorful past, but Gilman is a reminder that mining wasn't just a boom and bust adventure story. It left behind real environmental damage that communities are still dealing with more than a century later. And in Gilman's case, that damage was severe enough to make an entire town permanently uninhabitable. Every other town on this list was abandoned by choice. Gilman was abandoned by order. If this video was worth your time, consider liking and subscribing and leaving a comment about which of these ghost towns you'd most like to visit. And if you've already been to any of them, we'd like to hear about your experience. You can also choose your next video from the end screen. See you next time.